Hello there and welcome to this video on data security and integrity processes. This is a 4-part video. The first one covering cryptography, the second video covering biometrics, the third one covering malicious and accidental damage, and the fourth one we're talking about malicious software. In this video we're going to talk about cryptography in general, and we need to know a few things. We need to know the need and purpose of cryptography and describe the techniques of cryptography and the role in protecting data, and also follow a couple of different algorithms and programs that are used in cryptography. So what is cryptography? Well, cryptography is the act of scrambling a piece of plain text into ciphertext so that it can't be immediately understood by someone if they were to intercept it. And for our exam, we need to be comfortable explaining what cryptography is in terms of encryption and what that means, decryption and what that means, and also the piece of information needed to decrypt a message, and that is commonly called a key. And I'll be using those key terms throughout this video, and I'll explain them as I go. Most modern day applications rely on cryptography to protect data, from storing your passwords in an encrypted file to using secure socket layers, or you might have heard of SSL, to transmit data over the internet securely. Without cryptography, online, banking and e-commerce, things like that, they just wouldn't be trusted. And the problem we have is that we can't trust people nowadays to send from point A to point B without it potentially being intercepted. If you've heard of packet sniffing before, we have something called a man-in-the-middle attack, where a phisher will packet sniff and try and intercept your packets of data to maliciously interrogate that data for their own personal use. And just imagine if we had the world's fastest computer and we tried to break a secure socket layer certificate that a bank will use, for example, with public and private keys, and we try to brute force that with our computer, it would take longer than the universe has been around, plus more in the future, and would still only be a sixth of the way there. And that's with our current, fastest, best technology, a sixth of the way there. So your pennies are safe in your bank account currently, but there are still problems that exist. And one of the big problems is something called symmetric encryption. And this type of encryption uses the same key to encrypt as it does to decrypt, and therefore it's reversible. And a good example of symmetric encryption is the Caesar cipher. Now, if somebody gets hold of the key, then it's game over. So the key needs to be stored somewhere very secure. And the good thing about symmetric encryption is that it's very simple and it's very quick and easy to set up. But the downside to that is that they're very easy for modern computers to crack. And a computer can crack an encrypted message simply by trying thousands of different alternatives in a short amount of time, and we call that a brute force attack. Now let's look a little bit closer at the Caesar cipher itself. The reason why it's called a Caesar cipher is named after Julius Caesar, because it's thought that he was one of the first people to use encryption when sending messages to his supporters and his generals on the battlefield. But the problem was, as he was sending his messengers back on horse, they were intercepted and his messages were read, and that got back to the enemy. So what he started to do was he started to encrypt, so whoever stole the messages couldn't understand what they were, but the generals all knew the key to decrypt the code. And that's what you see on that dial there. The key will dictate how far we move in the alphabet. And if you take a look at this example, my plain text here says my name is Jonathan, and I have a shift here, which is my key. If I change it to 1, A becomes B, change it to 2, it becomes C, change it to 3, it becomes D, and just keep shifting down the alphabet. So if I set my key to 3, you'll notice now the ciphertext is quite incoherent. If I go to decode, then my ciphertext is back in. I use the key of 3, and you can see that the plain text is now displayed as the original message. So as long as you know the key, you can apply it, shift the alphabet, and it will produce the correct message. But still, by modern day standards, this is still pretty rubbish. And now we move on to something called asymmetric encryption, and it deals with one-way mathematical functions rather than being able to be reversed like the symmetric encryption. Sometimes you'll hear this referred to as public or private key encryption, But it is more secure, but it is slower because it's more difficult to carry out. So if you look at asymmetric encryption, we're going to have a few key players in this example. The first one being my friend Donald. Say hello, Donald.
I'd love to say hello.
And we have my other good friend, Boris Johnson. Say hello, Boris.
Hi folks, Boris Johnson here.
Now, if they were to have a conversation, Donald Trump would be able just to speak directly to Boris Johnson, send him a letter or an email or something like that, and Boris Johnson could reply back to Donald Trump. No problems there. If we lived in a world like this, we wouldn't need any encryption at all if everybody was honest. However, there are people out there that are there to cause us harm. Thinking about our man-in-the-middle attack again, we've got our good friend Vladimir. Say hello, Vladimir.
Кто сказал да?
Yeah, I don't know what he just said. So, Donald Trump will want to speak to Boris Johnson again. However, this time, there's a person in the middle, and Donald Trump doesn't know that Vladimir is listening into the conversation. So he could listen to the conversation, not alter any of the data at all, and it looks like it gets to its destination without being tampered with. And again, Boris Johnson would send his message back, it'd go through Vladimir, and then off it goes to Donald Trump. Those two are none the wiser that this data has been looked at or read. So this is where we need encryption. And with asymmetric key encryption, or public and private key encryption, we have two keys, a public key and a private key. The thing to remember here is the private key never leaves the sender. So Donald Trump, if he wanted to send a message to somebody, he holds on to his own private key. That is going to decrypt our ciphertext into plain text so we can read it. The public key is available to everyone that wants to send Donald Trump a message. So we give our public keys out. Vladimir can have one. Boris Johnson can have one. Boris Johnson's got a top secret document there that he wants to encrypt so Vladimir can't see it. He uses the public key because it has the instructions to encode that message and turn that plain text into cipher. So he does that, and then he sends it back to Donald Trump, and Donald Trump uses his private key in order to decrypt that message. And even if Vladimir intercepted it, he couldn't actually understand it because he doesn't have the key to decipher it. Now, if Donald Trump wanted to send Boris Johnson a message, Boris Johnson would have his private key and he would send his public keys out to both Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. That would be public on the network. And that contains the instructions for Boris Johnson's cryptography method. And Boris would then expect Donald Trump to send him a message and use his public key in order to encrypt his message and send it back. Boris Johnson would then receive the document and decrypt it using his private key. And that means Donald Trump and Boris Johnson can have a conversation between themselves and cipher all of their text. And Vladimir Putin would have absolutely no chance of understanding what was said unless he stole the private keys from both Donald Trump and from Boris Johnson. Remember, the important message here is that you do not release your private key. And who do we have to thank for our modern day encryption methods? Well, in the bottom left-hand corner there, you'll see Ralph Merkle. It was his idea and concept, and then it was developed further by Martin Hellman, who's on the right-hand side, and Whitfield Diffie at the top. And they invented the asymmetric key in 1975. But this discovery revolutionised fields of cryptography and electronic warfare. And when Diffie came up with the idea of asymmetric encryption, it seemed likely that no such mathematical function even existed. And the point of this is, it's asymmetric, so it can't be reversed, it's only one way. And now this caused a real problem, because the American government, they wanted to keep these secrets for themselves, for their military, but Diffie released his asymmetric encryption algorithm for free on the internet, which meant that everyone in the world suddenly had access to an incredibly strong military-grade encryption system. One of the ciphers that we use today is called the RSA cipher. And the RSA comes from the three men that actually invented the cipher itself: Ron Rivest, Adil Shamir, and Leonard Alderman. And this is a very simple algorithm that uses huge primary keys. Even though the algorithm is simple, it's very difficult to decipher unless you know what those primary keys are. So let's have a look then at how the RSA cipher actually works. Okay, then let's start with the encryption. So this would be our public key. And let's say I have a pair of numbers and my numbers are 5 and 14. Accessible to everyone. Everyone can see them. But they're going to use that public key in order to encrypt their data. And let's say my data was the letter D. Okay, keep it nice and simple. The first step of the RSA cipher is to convert this into numbers. So D, if I was using A was 1, B was 2, C was 3, then D would be 4. And then what I would do is I would raise 4 to the power of my first key. So 4 to the power of 5 is 1024. And then what I've got to do is use the second key, 14, to mod this number. So using the modulus operator, remember modulus divides the number by 14 in this case and gives you just the remainder. So 14 goes into 1024 73 times. And that gives us 1022, and that leaves us with 2 left over. So our answer from this, once we've used the modulus operator, is 2. And if we then convert that back, that will give us the letter B. So D has now been converted into B. So how do we decrypt then? Well, this time our keys actually change. I've changed 5 to 11 there, and that's quite important because those keys actually do have some kind of relationship, but those numbers would be massive prime numbers, not just small numbers like I'm using here. And the point of this is, I know what those numbers are and you don't, so they are my private key. And the process stands where this is my cipher. I'm going to turn this into a number, so B would be the number 2, and then I'm going to raise it to the power of the first number again, 2 to the power of 11, and that gives us 2048. And you do the same thing again. We mod that with 14, and what that gives us is 4 after you've done the remainder. And if we convert that back, that becomes D, which was our original data. So like I said before, the RSA cipher is actually quite simple to perform. It's just the numbers that we use are very significant. So these numbers are only small here, but these numbers are absolutely huge. And when you look at the numbers that banks use, it's very, very difficult even for a computer to calculate these numbers so that pairs of keys actually match. So now we need to talk about comparing these cryptographic methods. We talked about symmetric encryption, we talked about asymmetric encryption, but this interesting looking fella here, this is Claude Shannon, and he was groundbreaking in creating the rules for different cryptographic methods. So the question you should be asking yourself is, how easy is it to break our cryptographic methods? Well, Claude Shannon said that the amount of secrecy of your algorithm should determine the amount of work needed to encrypt and decrypt it. So the more complex, the more effort needed to decrypt. And the cipher must work on all types of data, not just text and not just numbers or characters, for example, but all kinds of data. And that's why in the RSA cipher, we converted our letter into a number. And the algorithm should be simple to minimize implementation errors. And that's simply so we don't get anything wrong in our algorithm. And if an error is introduced, it should not impact the rest of the message. So if the error's at the start of your message, it won't have a knock-on effect to the end of your message. The size of the ciphertext should be no larger than the original plaintext. And that means that if your plaintext is 5 letters long, then your cipher should also be 5 letters long. But how do we actually break encryption? Well, if you find out the key, then more often than not, decryption will be fairly straightforward. We can apply a brute force attack by trying to guess the key, by trying every possible combination of answers or keys until the match is found. And obviously, for a human, this is a very, very slow process, but modern day computers are very fast and they can often reduce the amount of time needed to actually break your encryption. Or we can take a smarter approach, something called a statistical analysis. If certain groups of characters appear more often than others in the ciphertext, then the frequency could be compared. The most common letter in the English language is the letter E, and this was something that was used by the Germans to try and decrypt our ciphers, and also the English to try and decrypt the German ciphers in World War II. So those are the two standard methods to try and break encryption. So we need to make sure that the strength of our algorithm is as high as possible, and to do that we use something called diffusion. And you might have come across this in an experiment at secondary school with a deodorant, for example. And what diffusion is it's changing a single character of the input, and it'll have a knock-on effect and change many characters of the output. Whereas diffusion in science is you'll have a very high concentration of particles, and as diffusion and space spreads out, the particles will also spread out. So you'll get a weaker smell. And done well, it makes analysis much harder because we can't really retrace our steps, and the resultant cipher can also be combined with random data to further prevent against frequency or dictionary attacks. And we call that random data a salt. And a salt is random data that's used as an additional input to a one-way function, and it hashes a password or a passphrase. And the primary function of a salt is to defend against dictionary attacks. So here's an example. Alice and Bob have their passwords. Each of them will be assigned a random salt, which is a 12-bit binary number. And notice that they're both different. Now what's stored in your file will be the password, but it will also be concatenated with the 12-bit binary number. So if somebody finds out Alice's password and it wasn't salted, then they could easily work out the method of doing that and apply it to Bob's and find out Bob's password. And obviously that's not very good, but if we add our random salt, that becomes much more difficult. So that's great. We've got lots of algorithms out there currently that are strong enough to protect our data. But what about this? Hopefully you know what this is. This is a quantum computer. And it doesn't deal with numbers the same way modern standard computers do. It doesn't use zeros and ones, but it can use any different form of 0 and 1. It uses qubits. And it gets very complex, and it's outside the scope of our A-level computer science. However, it's a very interesting topic. If quantum computers can do what they say they can do, then our modern cryptography methods will be blown out the window in a matter of milliseconds. So cryptography and decryption methods that will take millions of years to complete will be done in a matter of seconds with quantum computing. And obviously that's going to cause a headache for you trying to protect your money in your bank. But it's a very interesting topic that you can do lots and lots of reading about. But these are computers in their infancy currently. But if all goes ahead, they'll revolutionise computer science as we know it. And that's everything that we need to cover in this video on cryptography. In the next video, we're going to cover biometrics. And hopefully, I'll see you there.